Welcome to Party Politics. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also a political science professor here at the University of Houston. Thanks for joining us and talking some politics on a pretty interesting week. First of all, the Cougs are number one in basketball, at least as of this recording, so we're not going to jinx it, right?
Well, but
we don't want the party politics curse on it.
I think, well, it's not a curse, but the most important thing for me, at least, is that the women's swimming and diving team, they won for the 7th consecutive year their championship of the American Athletic Conference.
This is great news.
It's never been done, and it's it's consistently, and you have to watch them swim. They're just simply amazing.
That's
so
great.
Congratulations to the women's swimming and diving team at the University of Houston.
Hey, that's it. Keep it up, right?
Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
Very nice.
Absolutely.
Not surprising because obviously, Cougs dominated every sport. But one surprise this week politically was that President Joe Biden made a trip to Kyiv, right? This was a President's Day kind of surprise that people weren't really expecting. It's the first trip from a U.S. president to a war zone in nearly a decade. Other presidents, of course, have visited these sorts of conflict-ridden zones. You remember George W. Bush going to Iraq during the Iraq War. So it's something that presidents have done to kind of gain a kind of momentum towards an end. Right. And the president's got a couple of things that he's asking for from Congress. The first is that he's announced a new $500 million aid package for the Ukraine, basically setting them up like G.I. Joe, artillery, ammunition, anti-tank weapons, howitzers, and other kind of long-range weapons, they said, in quotes, which makes me think, it's very G.I. Joe technical.
Right.
The other is that they have come to determine that there may be war crimes committed in the Ukrainian conflict. So there's a lot on the plate of the administration here in terms of the foreign policy towards Ukraine. What do you make of the president's surprise visit? Is this going to kind of change some minds? Because there are a lot of Republicans who say we should spending too much money to begin with, and we should just kind of close off the spigot.
Well, I think there's two fronts. One is the domestic front, and in the domestic front,
no pun intended, right?
Right.
Yeah. Or maybe you did intend it.
Well, no, not at all. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, released a letter praising President Biden for this move. Obviously, at the end, he says, well, okay, these are words. We want to see action. And there is a point where people want to see more action in terms of U.S. involvement. But obviously, this has to be worded in such a way that, you don't escalate the conflict. And I think that U.S. foreign policy and, Secretary of State Blinken, what they're trying to do is, move forward, but without really getting into the conflict all in.
Yeah.
And then you have the international front, and I think the international front is very interesting because this gives a signal to Europe and, basically NATO allies saying, we are here until this thing is done.
Yeah, okay.
And that creates that part. And then you have Russia.
Wow. Another front, yeah.
And that one is a little bit more complicated because President Putin gave his State of the Union.
Yeah.
And
this is called the State of the Putin, right?
A state of, I don't know.
Whatever
state
he
of
says
Putin,
goes,
right,
yeah.
Absolutely. There's no union or anything like that. But he was very belligerent, right? He's pulling down, not quitting one of the last remaining nuclear weapons treaties with the U.S. He's like saying, well, I'm not going to play now.
Yeah.
So he's pushing it, and we'll see, at the end what's going to happen. But once again, this was a gut punch to Putin's, public image in Russia.
Well, and the fact that the president of the United States could go there in the middle of this hostile conflict and safely enter and exit is a kind of, as you say, a kind of gut punch to the efforts from the Russian government who wanted to have this as a quick turn around and basically, grab that territory. It's been a year, and that's why Biden went. It was like the anniversary of the invasion, so that's interesting. This clearly reaffirms the U.S.'s role there, and so there's going to be dissent about this. Like we said, the Republicans are a little bit cautious about how much to spend and whether to spend, any more. But certainly this helps, I think, to kind of prime people's opinions about this because, foreign policy is a kind of policy where presidents have a lot more control, right? They're able to shape opinions. They're able able to, make sure they can convert elites to their side. So although Republicans are going to complain about it, this is certainly something where the president has a natural advantage.
Right.
And this kind of a show on President's Day, right, like makes it something really powerful.
The logistics, there's no U.S. boots on the ground over there.
Yeah.
So the logistics must have been a nightmare, right? Yes. He traveled 10 hours by train from Poland to Kyiv, overnight ride back and forth. So, obviously the U.S. gave heads up to Russia saying, like, President Biden's going there. You better not.
You don't
if
try.
If
right,
not, like,
it's going to end up being like a movie, right?
Yeah,
But you're right, and you're right about Russia too. The New York Times this week had a really interesting article about the way that the Russian people have handled this conflict, and it's telling because although initially it was assumed that this was not a country that was going to go in that direction, like Putin campaigned on basically being a kind of peace candidate, but that didn't happen obviously. But internally, a lot of the Russian state control is essentially feeding the people in Russia the company line, right? So all the news channels have basically dropped entertainment in favor of more kind of news and political talk show stuff. In schools, they do flag raising ceremonies that they're like in patriotic education. So there's a lot of control there that's, I think, at least for now, settling in, right? I mean, the U.S. is still, population-wise, public opinion-wise, a little bit, kind of uneven on this, more supporting than not. But the Russian government's all in, and so are the Russian people.
Let me ask you a question. Since you are a presidency highly renowned scholar.
Indeed, sir. Yes, tip of the cap. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I'm waiting for my compliment. I'll give you some time.
It's not on my notes here, but I'll get to you. I'll get to, maybe if I keep going down.
But the question is, Russia is not a democracy. Public opinion in Russia is, like my opinion on baseball, right? It's non-existent or non-important.
Or heavily biased, right?
Exactly. So my question is, how long Russia apparatus is controlled by obviously President Putin, but also by these big Russian oligarchs. So all the sanctions and everything else is hurting them, right? It's bad for business. So my question to you is, when do you think that the Russian oligarchs are going to say, you know what, enough? Like, these need to stop now and you need to go?
Like when the sanctions start to work. It's a good question, actually. And that's really what the U.S. is hoping for. They're hoping that steady pressure really makes a difference. And although we have a kind of short-term memory in, politics, that's why we do the show every week, because there's always something crazy and new and like a huge list of it. Most of the time, this sort of economic sanctions take longer to work. So a year is not like out of the question for this to be a kind of timeline trajectory. So it might be that it's still working. But one of the things that was reported in this Times piece is that essentially a lot of people are leaving Russia, right? People who disagree are either being kind of targeted and pushed out or just leaving on their own. So it's a changing country in a way that is going to set up this kind of geopolitical conflict in the future. So Ukraine is kind of just step one of, I think, a lot more of these, or really, frankly, step 10 of like 100, because there is going to be more of this to come. But let's go from one institution to another. The U.S. Senate this week. The U.S. Senate actually obviously made up of a bunch of different types of people, and that's why it's interesting. Some of them very old, some of them very young, some of them elected for a long time, some elected very recently. On the front, actually, this week, Dianne Feinstein, DiFi, is leaving the Senate. We reported weeks ago that, California was jumping ahead, they decided that they, many candidates weren't going to wait for her to retire, since obviously, she's older now and has been in the Senate for a long time. She's decided to actually retire, which is going to set off a kind of frenzy of a bunch of different candidates. Katie Porter, Democratic Representative; Adam Schiff, Democratic Representative; Barbara Lee, Democratic Representative, likely to announce soon. Dianne Feinstein has been in the Senate since 1992 when there were 2 women, and now there are 25. So she's seen history unfold.
Oh, yeah.
She's also seen, frankly, California move from a kind of purple state to a very blue state. So, her time in the Senate has been pretty monumental in that way. So it's interesting. And the reason why we care about this is because we talked about this a few weeks ago. But basically, the Democrats are going to be in big trouble in terms of defending Senate seats in 2024. They hold a narrow lead right now, 51 to 49, but they're going to have to defend 23 of 34 seats up for grabs, and just 1 or 2 means Republicans are going to get that back. And some of those seats include West Virginia, Montana, Ohio, not Democratic strongholds anymore, places where the likelihood is, even if they get the senators who are Democrats in those states to run again, that they might lose those seats. So every seat matters. Not that California is going to go red, but
Right.
the tenor of it might matter. So
Right. No, it's very interesting because, California for the past, 30 years or something like that, until Senator Alex Padilla came to power, has been represented by women.
Yeah.
So that's, very telling in terms of the political culture of the state, right? And also the nature of having women being represented in California in the U.S. Senate. So I think that's very interesting to see. You have Katie Portman, as you said, Barbara Lee also running, potentially they already announced.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think all but announced, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think that it might keep it in that tradition, and I think it's something that is extremely important. And then on the other hand but it's going to depend who runs on the Republican side. And I think that's going to be key, right? They have to pick the right candidate for the right stage. So if they pick, super, let's say, MAGA Republicans in a state that are like, maybe not, it's not going to work, right?
It wasn't so long ago that Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor as a moderate Republican.
Yeah.
It's a state that was in transition for much of the 90s. I worked in California in the politics, and it was pretty interesting to see. It was pretty interesting to see. Yeah, I didn't get any tan. I literally didn't see the sun or the beach the whole time I was there.
I'm going to report you.
But I say this because a lot of people thought that Texas would become like California.
Okay.
And we're going to talk in a few minutes about Senator Cruz running for re-election and kind of what that prospect looks like. But a lot of people think that because of the demographic change that happened in California in the 80s, late 80s and 90s, that Texas would basically follow suit. It hasn't. And Texas is certainly behind California in terms of that mix, but it's certainly the case that Texas hasn't moved in that direction the way that California did. So it's interesting to see that transition over time. So speaking of senators who've been in for a long time to senators who have not been in for a long time, who've just been elected this week, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman checked himself into Walter Reed National Military Health Center to receive treatment for clinical depression. He's a freshman senator, and this is his second hospitalization since the campaign. He had a stroke on the campaign, which set him back in terms of being able to do a lot of that campaigning. I think this is pretty brave. I mean, people looked at this and said that Fetterman was the kind of, macho candidate who was going to really kind of tell it like it was. But I actually think that's the wrong reading of what this was. I think that he was an honest candidate. Like, he presented himself as somebody who was of the people. Like, he knew people's struggles, and you saw that all over his campaign ads. They liked him. They trusted him. And, I don't know how the stroke played into it. Probably not that much because things are so partisan now. But he captured the hearts of these Pennsylvanians. And so I think being honest is his secret sauce. And I think for him to seek treatment is pretty bold in the middle of all this.
Well, absolutely. And especially since, depression or clinical depression is not something that is uncommon. According to the CDC, you have around 4.7% of adults age 18 and over. That translates in around 12.3 million people in the country, adults in the country, that suffer clinical depression. And there has always been this taboo about mental health. And I think that having Senator Fetterman saying like, I have it and I have to treat it. And depression is a treatable symptom, right? You can treat depression with the right combination of, therapy, right combination of, medical advice in terms of medicines or this or that. So I think it's very brave. And I think that, it's not put under the rug, and that would make him, being closer to the people. Because, the people, suffer these type of stuff.
Struggle,
financial, mental health, physical health, and it's, always the hustling. And he's been portrayed as a hustler. He's like, I have this thing. I'm, honest enough, as you said, go check myself in. Let's see what happens.
And he's not the only one, actually. Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota came out to his, aide and said that she's been treated for depression. Richie Torres from New York also talked about being hospitalized for depression. So there is a precedent for this, and it's something that everybody has to deal with. And I think it just makes politicians all the more human, and that means that they're going to be better representatives one way or the other.
I agree.
But speaking of races, speaking of how the Senate might shape up, obviously Texas, as we said, has been a state people have identified as one of those that might flip. So far, no flipping. But as we talked about or hinted at last week, Senator Ted Cruz has said that he this week is going to run for Senate, not for president. He doesn't rule out running for president, but basically says he's going to focus on running for Senate. I got a call from a reporter, Gromer Jeffers, of the Dallas Morning News, and Gromer said flat out to me, I don't believe him.
Right.
I don't believe he's going to, run for Senate and not for president. But obviously, this is something that, is sort of to be taken up down the road. This is a tough map for Democrats, like we said. Few of the pickup opportunities include Texas and Florida, both really challenging. So if the Democrats are hoping to pick up Texas and Florida as part of their pathway to keeping the Senate, things are not going well. Picking up a Senate seat from Ted Cruz is going to be really tough. So what do you make of the possibility of Ted Cruz losing? Now, it's a presidential, so it's a little different than our past midterm, which was a disaster for Democrats.
Right.
What do you think of that prospect?
Well, I mean, Ted Cruz is a very, first of all, is one of the smartest politicians in the state of Texas, right? Has a pulse on public opinion, and especially on his key constituency, that he knows exactly what to do, right? Yeah. So he's very smart, he's very studious, and he knows exactly what to say, when to say, and how to get the votes, right? Now, also on the other hand, he's extremely polarizing. Right? Yeah. Either you like Ted Cruz.
Is it the beard? Is that
or you don't like it.
Right after he won, right? He grew the beard and people were like, nope.
So it's either or.
Okay.
There's no middle ground.
Right.
So either people like Ted Cruz or they don't like him. So that gives, at least it cracks the door open for Democrats to look for a good challenger. I'm not going to even say you cannot recycle, potential candidates.
I don't know. That Democrats have done that though too, right?
Yeah. So it hasn't worked, right?
It definitely hasn't worked. There.
Right.
Yeah.
So you need to have, a very good candidate that is articulate, that knows what to do, and also the Democratic Party needs to invest heavily.
Yeah. The other thing I think they need is an issue, right? And I don't mean issues, I mean issue. That needs to be the driving focus, the most vulnerable thing that Ted Cruz has or the Republican Party has. That's what they need to use. Now, keep in mind, this is going to be during the presidential election, right? So they're concurrent, and you're going to have Donald Trump running. For how long, we don't know, right? But certainly that's one of those things that Democrats have used successfully to be able to say that Republicans are too extreme and maybe they can lump Ted Cruz there. But you're right. I mean, Cruz's approval is at 44, and that's pretty good. That's about as good as most other statewide officials. It was lower earlier in the year. It rebounded. Remember, just a year ago was the period where Ted Cruz fled for Cancun during the winter
Allegedly.
storm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, with one suitcase. So that became kind of a reoccurring meme that's problematic for him, and I think that's definitely a political liability. But the other thing is that this is basically a brand new state. It's funny that after 6 years, the population has changed so much, right? New people have come from all over, so there's going to be a whole new breed of kind of voter who looks at this. For Democrats, they're better off in a presidential election year. Typically, the gap is a little lower. Donald Trump won Texas, but only by about 5%. And that's Trump, so it's a little different than like a different kind of Republican, but that's definitely an issue. For Democrats, the real problem is not only just general turnout, although they're going to get a bump in a presidential, but the fact that they had a bunch of known Democratic voters who didn't show up. About 700,000 Democrats didn't show up to vote in 22 that showed up in 18. Also, young people didn't turn out. They turned out 25%. That's 75% of young people stayed home. So that's a coalition they've got to get active. And if they don't, then I don't see a way that they're going to beat Ted Cruz, regardless of the numbers.
That's good candidate.
Yeah.
And a big pile of money, right?
Yeah.
And as you say, I think
how much money are we talking about here?
Millions.
Are we going to set this bet right now?
Yeah.
Under.
I mean, I'm not going to set any bets until you pay me my other bet.
Okay.
Because, I mean, if not, I'm I'm piling up.
So. Maybe we do it like all or nothing, like or double or nothing, right?
I see what you're doing. No. But the issue here is that, as you said, they need to pick a issue. One single thing that can rally people around. Because if they start talking about 11,000 things, people lose attention. So like, what?
Yeah. So it's been the common problem for Democrats, and it's been, I think, something that they can fix pretty easily. Some of the people who've been talked about as possible people to run against Ted Cruz, including former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julian Castro, Representative Colin Allred from North Texas, State Senator Roland Gutierrez, who's been very active on the Uvalde story, James Tallarico, who's a very young member, connected to education. So there are, I think, good candidates Democrats could come up with. But obviously, as you said, it's going to take a lot to get there. And Democrats have a tendency to kind of, be fairly vicious internally, and then their candidate comes out bruised and unable to compete. So that could be a potential problem. But talking about things that are bruised, we'd learned this week, actually, that vouchers are apparently not dead on arrival in the Texas legislature. The Speaker of the House, who has been kind of wishy-washy on support for vouchers, said this week that it wasn't DOA, which is basically a sign that it's not a no, but it's not a yes. So it does remind me a lot of kind of dating in high school, right? Not a no, but maybe like a later. We'll see. Yeah. Like, I'll take that. I was happy with that back in the day. So
you were?
I was very happy with that. Yeah, I'd take what I can get. We know the governor added this as an emergency item. This has been talked about in Republican circles for a long time. So it's certainly the kind of policy that's polarizing even among Republicans, and even more so this week when a new audio leak came out from the Texas Education Agency from one of the commissioners, the deputy commissioner. He basically said that this is a program that could in fact take money from public schools. So this is the first kind of admission to some degree that this is problematic for funding of public schools. What's your take on where vouchers are right now? Are we seeing momentum towards it, or is it still just kind of baby steps?
I think that, Democrats might play ball, right, one way or the other. Mm-hmm. If, the problem, let me take a step back.
Okay, yeah. So big step back, because Democrats playing ball with that would be pretty monumental.
So the issue here is how schools are funded, right? Our current funding schools are based on enrollment and not attendance. So if you have some money here, right, and you say, well, I'm going to give you, or you're going to be losing students because they're going to go to a private institution or whatever it is, regardless of the amount that the government is going to provide, right? So if you start losing kids in one school, right, they're going to get less money, right? So by the factor, yes, schools are going to be losing money. Yes. Public schools are going to be losing money because they're going to be losing kids. If you change that to enrollment and not attendance, then, right, you can, one way or the other, secure funding for public schools. Yeah. But the key issue here is that you cannot implement these without having a wider net in terms of how you're funding public schools based on enrollment and not attendance. Yeah. If they happen to do that, and Representative Gina Hinojosa just introduced filed a bill that would do that exactly, I think that they would have a chance to do it. Because on the other hand, the political alliance is between Democrats and rural Republicans. Because as we have said before, rural Republicans don't have options. So it's public school or public school, end of the question.
Completely.
So I think that makes it interesting. Yeah. And then Democrats would have another important opportunity there to extract more goodies in terms of education and say, you want to do your school vouchers? Fine. Okay. This is how much it's going to cost.
I see. Yeah. You're playing chess, right? That's good. Chess. And I think that Republicans have some cases been playing checkers, sort of things that the school system's going to be the same. You're not going to lose any money. Right. It's not true, right? It can't be true. It's just by the logic of it and by the way that the funding works. This is tricky because this is the kind of thing that is constitutionally provided. This isn't something that we just sort of can give more money to or not. Like, these things have to be done, or there's going to be lawsuits. But no matter what, there's going to be lawsuits, right? So I do think you're right. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts in terms of school finance, and the voucher thing really presents a lot of, complications. So we'll keep an eye on that. But I do think that at least there's been a kind of sense that there's not a, not a no right now. It's a maybe, and that's probably good enough for a lot of what the powers that be in the Republican Party want. But speaking of funding, actually, our last item of the week is that Glenn Hager, the controller for the state of Texas, has responded to a complaint from Harris County Constable Ted Heap, and what the controller finds is that Harris County, in fact, did defund the police. That issue here is a state law that was passed passed by the GOP in the last legislative session that bars large counties from cutting law enforcement spending without getting approval from voters. So basically what this amounts to is that the comptroller said that the county cannot increase property tax collections now, or they have to go to voters to ask them to okay it. And you know how voters love okaying, defunding police, in quotes. Now, the Harris County attorney this week said that he was going to challenge Hager's finding in court. Interesting. All around, obviously, as a legal matter, it's complicated, but I also is important because here is Glenn Hager able to step into this role and have a pretty sizable amount of control over what counties do, so he can fill that leadership vacuum in the future, no matter how this comes out.
Right. My response to that is that both Controller Hager and Harris County need to go and ask for help. And that help is going to come from Count Dracula, from Sesame Street, so they can get their numbers
1,
right.
2, 3 million.
Exactly. and start counting, right?
You're totally right.
Because this is an accounting issue.
Yeah.
It's how the county is applying a different formula, how the controller's office is applying a formula.
Yeah.
And I think, to a certain extent, let the courts decide which is the formula that is right, and see how it do it. So we're going to keep a very, very close tab on these accounting matters. But for this week, Brandon, this is it.
That's it. This was brought to you by the letters I and the number 1. I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. Thanks for watching.
I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
We'll see you next week.